Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. You know, I really wish Matt Fraction would go back to writing comic books for Marvel Comics. I miss him. I think all he's doing now is writing sex criminals with his wife Kelly Sue DeConnick, which admittedly is not a bad story. Basically, whenever two people have sex, time stops. So like they go to rob a bank, they sleep together, and then like they freeze time. So then they go and like rob a bank and then leave. It's actually a pretty cool concept. They wrote themselves as the characters, but his runs in Marvel Comics were the stuff of legend, right? Like all of Matt Fraction's work in Marvel Comics was freaking amazing, especially Iron Man and the 8 Nightmares, or the 5 Nightmares. That was amazing. Anyway, so getting into this, Odin fighting Galactus. All right, this is really cool. This basically picks up after the events of Siege, right? So it's after Siege and after Civil War. And so what this means is that Asgard is in Broxton, Oklahoma. Now, what does that mean? Okay, so following the events of really like the events of Ragnarok, that Asgard itself had essentially been obliterated when all the forces led by Loki invaded Asgard, and then Thor essentially fell, more or less died, or at least he was supposed to have been dead until Marvel brought him back. And then you basically went into the aftermath, which is J. Michael Straczynski's run, and I feel like we should cover that. But it's basically when Thor is traveling around and finding all the Asgardians in different bodies and so on and reawakening them, and then he recreates Asgard, or at least he recreates Asgard first in Broxton, then he goes and finds everybody. But this takes place after Siege, right? So Asgard being quote unquote destroyed by, really by like a lot of people, but for the most part, the Sentry being like leveled more or less. And so this is just kind of the aftermath. And that's the reason why in the story, you'll see Asgard looking like it's in shambles and sort of torn up, is because it comes after the events of Siege on Asgard. Now, having said that, since we have the Siege story down in the description, you guys can go check it out. This initially picks up with a guy named Pastor Mike. Now, I know it seems kind of weird to start out with a simple pastor, but this guy is actually gonna be really important, right? So Pastor Mike is basically this guy who's just, it's not really doom and gloom, like, you know, the world's ending and like it's all about the end times, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it is to a degree. He literally says, let's talk about the end of the world, but he's not one of those crazy pastors, right? He's just kind of like a pastor who's there and is more or less like, hey, we've got gods living among us, so this seems to indicate the end times. And so what it does is it jumps to Silver Surfer. Now, this is where things get really cool, because at the moment, Silver Surfer, again, is still basically the herald of Galactus, and he will be for some time. The cool thing about this story is this will actually change that to a degree, going into Infinity and the Avengers and New Avengers by Jonathan Hickman. But the idea behind this is that, again, Galactus being governed by his hunger, constantly on the need to feed, is basically looking for like a new world to consume. And he's informed by the Silver Surfer, I have found a new world. Like I found a place for you to consume. What I found here is something that basically would allow you to feed on it, because the energy is an insane amount of energy. I can sense it from where I'm at. And so what this means, like at least what it does, is it switches over to Asgard and Broxton, and you have Thor and you have Sif traveling down into the depths of the World Tree. Now, the World Tree in Marvel Comics is as much abstract as it is tangible. The idea behind the World Tree, we've talked about this before, the idea behind the World Tree is that this is basically just a means by which to say that the Asgardian mythos, right, like all the 9 realms are tied into the World Tree itself, in the sense that you basically have Asgard, and then you have like Jotunheim, and you've got Niflheim, and you've got, you know, all these different realms, Nidavellir and all that, and then you've got Midgard, Earth. Earth is tied into it, but the issue with like the creation of all things, according to Asgardian mythos, is one of those sort of situations where it's more hearsay and guesswork, because while Marvel does establish like essentially that Asgard was a creation of everything, or at least Asgard created everything. What Marvel also does is at the same time, they'll say, but the universe also came into existence by this form, right? So Marvel gives us like different iterations on how everything came into existence. The Asgardians say one thing, Marvel will depict it a different way. You go and you read like the Eternals and you listen to the Celestials, and it's like, well, they created everything. And so it really kind of bounces around and it fluctuates. But inside the World Tree is what's called this, well, it's just this giant seed, right? And we'll learn more about it here in a second. But inside this World Tree is this seed. And that's why why Thor and Sif have been sent there, to basically attain this artifact and to bring it back. Now, this artifact has a huge amount of power that's tied to it, right? Like a vast amount of power that's tied to this thing. But Thor's not initially told what it is by Odin. Now, for the most part, that's part and parcel, right? The only thing Odin says is, this is a seed, right? Now, Odin, for the most part, given his hubris and given his arrogance about himself, doesn't really see a need to tell Thor. It's just kind of like, you know, whatever. Like Thor, like he doesn't really need to know everything. You know, he doesn't need to know everything that I know. He simply just needs to be aware that, hey, like like there is a mission that I need you to go on, and that's basically it. And so switching back to the Silver Surfer, what we end up finding out is this energy source the Silver Surfer picked up, the one that could basically sate Galactus's hunger forever, basically, is this seed that Odin had captured, right? The seed that Odin had taken from the World Tree and brought back up again. And so it's kind of a cool thing, because one of the other things that I want to point to here is Loki. Right now, in the aftermath of Civil War, Marvel brought Loki back, right? Because he was just such a popular character. Really, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I think, made Loki more popular than he had ever been before. But what Marvel did is they basically de-aged him, right? They brought him back as a little kid, and he would go through and live his life as an Asgardian god, going from a child into his teenage years, into his young adult years, and into his adulthood, right? I mean, that was the intended progression of his character. Now, one of the things that came out of Ragnarok, at least the aftermath to Ragnarok during Straczynski's run on Thor, is that Loki basically stole the body that was meant for Sif. And so Loki was walking around as a chick, and he actually wasn't bad looking. What Loki's constantly trying to do as his younger self is basically prove his worth and demonstrate he's not the person he was when he was older, or at least in the past when he was like the god of mischief and always causing problems, right? It's one of these things where he's basically desperate to prove his worth and to show people he can be trusted. And so what it does from here is it basically switches over directly to Odin, who's kind of cultivating this seed. And what we end up learning here is that this seed is essentially, well, it's not really a seed in the traditional sense, that it's more of an egg. It's essentially a cosmic egg. And the idea behind this is that this egg was essentially created by eternity before all things existed, right? And with this egg came the creation of the current universe. And so the result was that the egg was ultimately found by Bor, the father of Odin, who in turn planted the egg inside of the World Tree of Yggdrasil and left it there for safekeeping, right? Now, again, this is just kind of go with it if you want to, right? The idea that like all things in existence came into existence because of eternity, creating this cosmic egg, and then basically it came into existence, or at least it continued on when the universe was born into its current form. You can take it for what it's worth, but you don't really have to believe it, right? Because it's just one of the origins of the universe that are out there. At this point in time, there's so many conflicting stories. Like if you go and you read Hickman's Avengers, the New Avengers, all things that came into existence were created by the builders, right? Like after the universe was made, it was the builders who started creating like planets and life and different things like that. So there's a ton of different origins out there. So it's by no means absolute, and you don't really have to find a way to reconcile it with anything else. It's not really, well, how does this fit in with all the other stuff? It's just kind of an origin story that's out there, and you don't really have to set a whole lot of store by it. But the fact that this seed has been captured by Odin and it's been placed inside the Destroyer armor, this leads the Silver Surfer to intervene. And the Silver Surfer literally shows up on the doorstep of Asgard and says, look, you guys have to give me the seed, because if you don't, Galactus is coming, and Galactus is going to take it. And Galactus has no problem, no qualms with facing off against all the Asgardians, right? I mean, your numbers are already depleted, your entire empire is in shambles, your power is barely intact. Like Odin, you do not have much to offer. And in response to this, Odin is, no, you're not getting it. Like, I'm not giving the seed to you. You know, and it's a really, really cool thing, right? Because we've never really seen an instance, well, I mean, we've seen like the Celestials and like the Asgardians fighting each other, but we've never seen a tried and true instance where like you end up having like Galactus showing up and facing off against all the Asgardians. It's not something that we've really seen before, but because of the fact that Silver Surfer shows up on the doorstep of Asgard in the aftermath of the fact that Asgard was almost totally obliterated and doesn't really take too kindly to invaders of sorts, this draws the ire of Thor. And Thor literally freaks out and starts attacking the Silver Surfer. Now, Silver Surfer says, you have this seed, and this seed has the power to sate the hunger of Galactus for all time, right? Until the universe ends, like forever and ever and ever, how long that happens to be. This is a vast amount of energy. But the issue with this is that in Odin's eyes, Galactus is not seeking the seed for the purpose of sating his hunger. He's seeking the seed to attain an extreme amount of power, right? To amplify the power he already has. And so that's why the answer is definitively no. And so what we end up doing is basically transition to Silver Surfer on the moon with Galactus sitting there, and he says, they said no. So like, now we got to do what we got to do. And so what this means is that war is coming to the Asgardians. The forces of Galactus, or at least Galactus himself and the Silver Surfer, are waging war against the Asgardians. And so what you have is basically all the forces of Asgard mustered to the best of their abilities, including Odin, as well as Thor, Sif, the Warriors 3, and like all those guys, the Brigade of Realms, which is basically like the military force of Asgard, all of them going to war against Galactus. And this is one of the coolest things ever. But what it also does is it switches over to the Weird Sisters. Now, the Weird Sisters are an old concept in Marvel Comics, right? They go all the way back to Journey into Mystery, issue number 102 in March of 1964. And the way that they're played out in Marvel is technically they're Olympian, but they hold more sway in Asgard, right? It's one of these things where like whatever it is that the Weird Sisters do, not even Odin can undo. Now the basis behind them, at least as far as they function in relation to Asgard, is that they're more of something akin to like seers, right? Like they foretell prophecies, and they're like, here's how you can avoid a possible future, different things like that. They're very much holy figures. But it's one of those words where Marvel kind of depicts them in a way to where like they're more powerful than Odin, but they're basically a source by which Odin or Thor or anybody can go to and say like, we're aware that there's a set of events coming, we're trying to find a way to avoid it. Is there anything that we can do to stop this? And that's the reason why Loki's here. Loki's gone to visit the Weird Sisters because what they've basically done is set him on this course where they say, if this fight continues to go the way that it is, then ultimately your brother's going to die against Galactus, right? Because your brother does not have, Thor does not have the power to stop Galactus. And that's true. I mean, he never did. Thor by himself is no match for Galactus, even with his hammer. It's Loki's desire to basically save everyone except for Odin, because, Odin will be able to save himself. But the cool thing about this is that you also have Galactus, who basically uses his power to form these kind of astral demons, more or less, these kind of forces that are out there. But where you would normally expect Odin and Galactus to immediately get into a physical altercation, instead, they actually start using their telepathy and telekinesis. A lot of the physical fighting that takes place at the outset goes on between like Silver Surfer, Thor, Sif, and the various, astral demons that were conjured by Galactus. But the telepathy, the telepathic battles between the two are actually pretty awesome, because what ends up happening is Odin goes into the mind of Galactus and literally goes back and starts looking in at his past life. And Galactus realizes it right off the bat, right? Like he realizes exactly what's going on at that exact moment, right? That basically he's experiencing this memory that he has of the universe before the current one, back when he originated, before that universe ended and he was born into the new one. And basically is like, okay, Odin's in my, like, this is not right, something's wrong here. Odin's in my head, right? That's what it is. Now, this is a testament to the power of Galactus, right? Because usually when you look at a circumstance where a person with telepathy is using their powers on someone else, the person who's being exposed to that telepathy doesn't usually know what's going on. So what you're talking about here are two beings with an astronomically high level of telepathy. Now, and so what you also end up having here is you basically have Odin, Odin in his younger years, where he's met by his brothers Vili and V. And of course, as a son of Bor, they've come across a scenario where like their crops are being consumed by various insects that are out there, right? I mean, their fields are being torn away, are being torn up, and the result is that they don't really have like normal food to eat in order to survive the winter. And so what we end up learning here is that at this point in Odin's life, they actually ended up consuming their dead, right? And so it's like Odin's being forced to relive these old memories, but so is Galactus. And so with this telepathic battle really kind of coming to a stalemate, right? In the sense that like both of them use their abilities and really kind of force the other to relive these memories, it boils down to like the two of them actually engaging in a conflict. Now, the problem with this is that Thor jumps in. Now, this is the problem here, is because the battle between Galactus and Odin is supposed to be a battle between the two of them because their power is so strong. With Odin being able to mess with the mind of Galactus, what this means is that Galactus has to essentially be in a steady state, right? In the sense that Galactus is trying to use his powers on Odin. When Thor goes flying in and Thor uses his hammer and Thor in turn like hits Galactus with it and attacks him, then like Odin immediately gets pissed because he's just like, why would you do that? Like literally I could have like pushed this guy away, right? Like we could have put him in a situation where he ultimately had to leave. And instead you've now put us in a situation to where he could just lose his mind entirely and attack everyone, right? It's Thor being rambunctious, being impetuous, and not being patient in the way that Odin is. And so as a result of this, you initially have Silver Surfer that tries to get him to stand down, that tries to get him to be quiet, and that tries to get him to say, you have to relax on this. And instead, like Thor freaks out and immediately just starts attacking Silver Surfer and just kind of, sending him on the offense. Now, the problem with this is that because of that, this fight boils down to a fight between Odin and Galactus. And the crazy thing about this, and it's one of the coolest displays, right? You guys have seen this picture a million times before, but Odin launches his attack against Galactus, goes flying head first and headbutts him and shatters his entire helmet, right? Like shatters the entire like facial structure of the suit he has. Now, the amount of power a person would need to pull that off is insane, right? Like it's an astronomical amount of power. But here's where the debate comes in terms of who would win, Odin versus Galactus. And in reality, I would give it to Galactus. And the reason why is because Odin basically headbutts Galactus and then falls into the Odin sleep. And the reason why that happens, the reason why the Odin sleep ends up happening is because Odin basically consumes more power than, or consumes a vast amount of power, right? So he's like a battery. When that energy is depleted, you put the battery in the charger. That's what Odin does. He goes and basically takes the Odin sleep, which replenishes his abilities. Because that was so extreme, because it was such an extreme level of power that was needed in order to be able to take out, or at least to headbutt Galactus in that way, it in turn depletes the power of Odin and he immediately crashes out, right? So like it's almost 100% of his power to achieve that. Galactus, on the other hand, gets up and basically says, Asgardians, you bore me, right? And just like reassembles his entire suit and everything. So he's basically fine. And this is why I say like, it seems as though Galactus would be able to defeat defeat Odin, right? Like in a knockdown, drag out fight, Galactus wins because of the fact, like in this particular scenario here. Now, there are a couple differences here. One of the big differences is that the Odin force is essentially the life force of Vili and V, the brothers of Odin, right? So while it is a vast and astronomical amount of energy, it's not unlimited. However, what you have with Galactus is you have the power cosmic, an infinite amount of energy, right? That's basically what it is. Now, the price for having the power cosmic is to always consume life that exists out there. So it's kind of a yin and yang in his regard, but you're talking about what's essentially an immensely vast but limited amount of power in relation to an unlimited amount of power, right? So it makes sense the person with the unlimited amount of power is going to win. And so as a result of this, where Loki continuing, is continually trying to prove himself, after talking to the fates, basically talking to the weird sisters, he ends up stealing the cosmic egg, right? That ends up stealing the Galactus seed and then leaves with it. Now, the last bit of information that we had about the Galactus seed is that it was sitting inside the destroyer armor. And that's incredibly important because one of the other big things to come out of this is you end up having Pastor Mike, who much like all the other members of Broxton, Oklahoma, are pissed about everything that's happened. Now, I kind of saved this to talk about it right now, but with the issues in Broxton, Oklahoma, one of the big problems that they had is Broxton was basically a peaceful town, right? Like it was a peaceful, quiet, sleepy town that really just sort of minded its own business and never really had a lot going on with things. The issue was that when Asgard was rebuilt, suddenly you had all the Asgardians existing out there. Because of the fact that Asgard was really floating about an inch off the ground, it wasn't really subject to the purview of S.H.I.E.L.D., following the events of Civil War and the Superhuman Registration Act. And so what this meant was Asgard could essentially operate with some measure of impunity. But what this also did is bring into events like Siege. And so when you have all these villains fighting all these heroes in Asgard, in Broxton, Oklahoma, and laying waste to the town, what it's done is it's pissed off the entirety of the town's denizens, right? The entire town's citizenry is pissed off and they're like, you guys need to leave. And so what ends up happening here, and this is probably one of the coolest moments in the whole story, what ends up happening here is Pastor Mike approaches Galactus, right? And he's like, please, 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 I beg of you, have mercy on our souls, spare our town, please, like, just leave. And the response of Galactus, no. And it's just like, I'm going to destroy everything and everyone. Like, they are all going to die. Your town is going to die, you are going to die, the Asgardians are going to die, and Asgard is going to be obliterated. That's just the way it is. I'm getting that Galactus seed come hell or high water. That's just the way it goes. And so it's cool here because in response to this, of course, you end up having the destroyer armor, which is basically summoned, and that, the destroyer armor in turn takes Thor's hammer. And it's kind of crazy because Mjolnir actually leaves Thor, right? Like it abandons Thor and immediately takes over to the, takes off to the destroyer armor. Now, this is kind of an important thing because this is one of the things that was built on by Jason Aaron, right? The idea that Mjolnir has a mind of its own, that it can function according to its own will. If Thor uses it, it's because the hammer allows Thor to use it. It's just, this is really kind of building up and it's really snowballing and leading into Jason Aaron's run where it's like the hammer can do whatever it wants to. It can basically be its own person. And so the result of this is that with Galactus basically being aware, or at least his last understanding, was that the Galactus seed was housed within the destroyer armor. When the destroyer shows up with the power of the Galactus seed wielding Thor's hammer, basically what this means is that Galactus would be totally obliterated, right? So ultimately he ends up leaving. Now, the other reason why he leaves is because of the fact that where he attempts to go and destroy the destroyer armor, knowing that the seed may be in there, the result of the Silver Surfer says, no, the seed is gone. The seed was taken out of the destroyer armor. We don't know where it is now, but it's basically gone here. And so what this means is that Galactus basically ends up retreating. Now, the reason why the seed is gone is because Loki took it. And this is where the prophecy of the Weird Sisters comes into play, right? The prophecy being that Loki has to act to remove the seed from the destroyer armor and then take it to some place where it can never be reached, essentially all the way inside the depths of Idrisil, all the way back at its very, very bottom, a point where nobody can really reach it, where it's just kind of lost in this sort of massive pool of what's essentially just time and space. And so as a result of that, Galactus ends up basically standing down and Galactus walks away. But this is again the significance of Loki, because had Loki not done that and had the seed been left inside the destroyer armor, Galactus could have destroyed it, right? Because with the destroyer armor, one of the things that was established back in the day when it came to Thor is that the destroyer armor is not indestructible. It can be obliterated. The Celestials wiped out the destroyer, right? I mean, the destroyer armor was created in relation to the Celestials returning for the second or third host, I think it was. And then the destroyer armor was made by the Skyfathers, by Odin and the Skyfathers, in order to basically defeat the Celestials. The Celestials obliterated it like that. They were just like done. And so it's kind of a cool thing, because what ends up happening is with Galactus leaving, knowing that it would be foolish for him to continue a war with the Asgardians because he, ultimately his hunger would get the better of him, right? Like with all the power he has, and while the power is essentially limitless, he has to consume the energy of life-sustaining planets in order to maintain access to that power, for lack of a better word. What this means is that if he were to continue this war with the Asgardians, he would inevitably lose eventually, because of the fact that it would just be a war of attrition and he would tire out, and ultimately he would end up falling. And so for his own self-preservation, he ends up leaving. Silver Surfer goes to find a new world for him, and that's basically the end of that. But what this does is it leads to a couple different things. The first is that Silver Surfer basically shows up and he grabs Pastor Mike, right, and says, I noticed that you essentially looked to Galactus and that you confronted him, having no idea what it was that you were facing, having no idea that you could have been obliterated in the blink of an eye, like you could have just been phased and just removed from all existence, right, as if you never were. But in the face of what was essentially absolute destruction, you still confronted him anyway. There's heroism in that. And so grabbing Pastor Mike and then showing up to Asgard alongside Galactus, what ends up happening is a Silver Surfer says, okay, fine, we can find a truce here. The Galactus seed is currently hidden away, like it's currently removed away. I don't know where it is. It's outside the view of myself and Galactus. As long as it stays there, we have no quarrel with you. But if you go and you find the Galactus seed and you bring it back, we will return and the war will continue. And ultimately, it's an acceptable state of circumstances. The problem with this is that there would be no way for them to know if Odin attained the Galactus seed again. And so as a result, you end up having Silver Surfer who stays on Earth. The problem with this is that Galactus needs a herald. And so Pastor Mike becomes the new herald for Galactus, and in turn, Silver Surfer stays confined to Earth. Now, there's a couple reasons why this was done, right? With Pastor Mike becoming Praetor, the new herald of Galactus, Silver Surfer returning to Earth and being locked there was a way for Marvel to kind of return him back to his roots, right? Because that's really where Silver Surfer gained the most prominence. He originally appeared in the Fantastic Four and the Galactus trilogy, and then following that, Marvel launched an ongoing series with his character where he was basically learning about Earthlings and what it meant to be a superhero on Earth. It proved to be exceedingly popular. People loved it. Marvel changed that, and then his stories were kind of hit and miss for the next few decades or so. And so really, going forward by what I would say is probably 20 years, 20, 25, maybe 30 years, Marvel jumps forward and they say, okay, let's confine him back to Earth again and let's see how this goes. The problem with that is stories weren't all that great, but it was cool to see. It was interesting for what it was, but that's basically where it ends. That's basically the story of Odin fighting Galactus. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.